Baldur's Gate 3 released at the start of August, and it was fantastic. A lovingly crafted, rich RPG set in the world of D&D. A part of its charm is the cast of party members available in the game, and they all also have Magic the Gathering cards. Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate released an entire year earlier. The two were actually supposed to come out fairly close together, but Baldur's Gate was delayed and Commander Legends could not be delayed, so there was a pretty big gap. It is a bit unfortunate because Commander Legends was a bit of a flop, but it's kind of been having a renaissance with the newfound love and appreciation since Baldur's Gate 3 came out. But now that people have gotten to explore these characters, a lot of people, myself included, have kind of fell in love with them. There are 10 possible companions in Baldur's Gate 3, and they all have magic cards. So I thought, why not make 10 commander decks, one for each of them? Before we get to that, you'll have to pass a skill check, and you'll have better odds if you scroll down and leave a like on this video and click on that fancy red subscribe button. And do let me know in the comments below if you've built any Baldur's Gate based commander decks and how you built them. Anyways, obligatory plug out of the way, let's get to the real stuff. For the actual list, I wanted to keep things under a $100 budget so they're a little more realistic to be able to buy, which I did do. I didn't want any of these decks to be overly expensive, and some of the cards can be upgraded, or if you want to make it even more budget, some expensive cards can even be taken out. Let's start with the first companion you have any interaction with, Lazelle. Her magic card makes it so you get an extra counter anytime you put a counter on a permanent. So she kind of builds herself, counters. But what background to give her? For the unaware, choose a background means you play 2 commanders, with one of them being a legendary enchantment that gives your commander a unique ability. For Lazelle, there are a few options. Agents of the Shadow Thieves could be a kind of Voltron style by attacking the biggest threat. Clan Crafter could be an artifact sacrifice deck. But for this list, I went with Master Chef. Master Chef makes your commander enter the battlefield with a 1/1 counter, and all other creatures enter with a 1/1 counter. So as you can probably guess, it's a +1/+1 counter deck. To spice things up a little bit, I opted to include creatures with X in their casting cost and enter with X +1/+1 counters. Not only will Lazelle give them an extra one, but so will Master Chef if both are on the battlefield. So even a smaller X cost will still enter the battlefield with a decent amount of counters. Cami of Whispered Hopes is especially strong because not only does it give an extra counter on its own, it also can become a very big mana dork. Forgotten Ancient is also spicy, has any spellcast gives it a 1/1 counter, and then you can move them onto other creatures. If Lazelle is on the battlefield, this pretty much makes these counters become a 2-for-1. Since we have access to green, we have a solid ramp package to start getting a lot of mana to put mana into X spells and to give creatures more counters. Since you're playing counters, Sigarda Summons is especially strong and basically turns all your creature into 4/4 flying angels, which is maybe a bit out of character for Lazelle because he's kind of an asshole, but good cards are good cards. You even have a cheap infinite combo in Rosy Cotton and Scurry Oak. When Scurry Oak gets a 1/1 counter, you create a scroll token, and when a token enters the battlefield, Rosy Cotton puts a 1/1 counter on a creature, so this gives you infinite scrolls that if you both have Lazelle and Master Chef on the battlefield are 3/3s. Granted, having infinite 3/3s and infinite 1/1s is not really that different because they basically accomplish the same thing. And while I'm not going to go over every card choice here, the full lists are on Marksfield and they will be available in the description below and flashed up on the screen like now once I'm done talking about it. With Lazelle done, the next possible companion you can meet is Shadowhunt. Like Lazelle, you will also need to choose a background, and there are a few different options. You have Agent of the Iron Throne, which does a little burn damage, Criminal Past to give her a stat boost by having creatures in the graveyard, and maybe Cloakwood Hermit to have a sack source all the time, but I think there was a more interesting one. Notice how Shadowhunt taps herself for the effect, and there also happens to be a background that interacts with that. Haunted One. This makes it so when a commander creature becomes tapped, all your creatures that share a type with it get +2/+0 and undying until end of turn, which means if they die with no counters, they come back with a +1/+1 counter, so our background is Haunted One. It is important to note that since sacrificing is a part of Shadowhunt's cost and not effect, the creature you sacrifice won't get undying. However, the deck is built in a way to sacrifice clerics for value, not just Shadowhunt. Raids can make everyone sack a creature and have them return to the battlefield if Haunted One's effect goes off by sacrificing a cleric. They will just return with a counter, so you make everyone pay for Braid's effect while you still keep all your creatures. Shadow Right Priest lets you tutor for any black creature and just put it on the battlefield, and with Haunted One's effect it's pretty much free since you sacrifice the cleric, which is what type Shadowhunt has. Doom Necromancer lets you sack itself to trade it off for a creature on the battlefield, and with Undying you get to use it twice. Since you're sacrificing so much, of course you're playing the creature dying equals burn damage package. Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat are both there, and since we're in mono black, we got good old Gary to do burn damage while gaining a bunch of life. Potlung Reanimator is especially nice for clerics, since whenever one is put into the graveyard from play, you get a 2/2 zombie to replace it, and if the cleric had Undying, well, you just get it back, so you pretty much got a free zombie. You do need to tap for Shadowhunt's ability, so we also have some artifacts to let you untap it to use it more than once. Majorite Stones untaps any creature with a tap ability, Patriarch's Seal is a mana rock that can untap a legendary creature, Puppet Strings lets you tap or untap a creature, which can be nice if you want Haunted One's effect to go off but you don't have to sacrifice fodder for Shadowhunt's effect. For a Haunting One's effect, Undying puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, but Retribution of the Ancient lets you remove one for just 1 black mana, so you can keep that creature around for even longer. It is worth noting that Haunted One only affects creature on the battlefield when Shadowhunt gets tapped, so you don't get infinite Undying triggers. Anyway, here's the full deck list. You're going to be drawing a lot of cards and sacking a lot of creatures. Since Shadowhunt is a disciple of Shar, you sacrifice them. And now we're kind of in a free fall, so we can't really go in exact chronological order since the game becomes much more open after you meet these two characters. So let's talk about the most boring commander, I think, Astron. As good as the character is, the commander card, not so much. It's not bad, it's just kind of basic. It's basically built to be life gain and life burn. This is the first one here that doesn't have a background, and Astron lets you either make everyone lose life equal to the life they lost, or let you gain life equal to the amount of life you gain at your end step. This can lead to a big amount of damage with the cards that deal half damage to life totals. So stuff like Wound Reflection, Revenge, Fraying Omnipotence all become way better. You're also playing a general life gain package with stuff like Soul Warden and Searcher Priest, and the likes, as well as payoffs for life gain like Felidor Sovereign, which can win you the game if you have 40 or more life, or Divinity of Pride, which is just a huge dumb idiot flying lifelinker. Then of course we have burn from gaining life with Veto, Sanguine Blood, Cliffhaven Vampire. If you do want to spend some extra money, you can also include Exquisite Blood, though it's a more pricey card so it's not on this particular list. The biggest downside to Astron is that you can only choose one target opponent to lose life, not any opponent. So that's why we have Stronic Resonator in the pocket to at the very least hit 2 of them, especially after a turn you play a spell that makes everyone lose half their life. Tainted Sigil is also very funny to gain a shit ton of life in one turn. I'll be honest, this is probably the deck I like the least from the 10 despite liking the actual character a lot. It just kinda comes with the territory to being a generic Orzhov life gain burn deck. It's just not a particularly original or new concept. Let's shift gears to who is my favorite companion of Baldur's Gate 3 that I had a very weird astral 3-way with 2 copies of himself, Gale. Gale's effect triggers when casting an instant or sorcery spell that lets you cast a spell of the opposite type from your graveyard. Sadly, you still have to pay the mana cost for this. Gale is another background commander, so you could use something like Guild Artisan to kind of help ramp by creating treasure tokens, Scion of Halaster to control what goes in the graveyard, but ultimately I felt like you kind of need ramp, so we need something with green. Unfortunately, none of them really synergize all that well with Gale. Master Sev just gives creatures counters, but we're not really playing that many creatures. Hardy Outlander is great, but again, we're not playing creatures, nor dragons for Acolyte of Bahamut, and we're not really putting creatures in the graveyard for Cloakwood Hermit. So, the only remaining green one is Raised by Giants, which I mean, if we cast it, Gale is a lot safer because he's a 10-10 instead of just a 1-3. And what better deck for the Prodigy of Waterdeep than a deck with giant spells? So we ramp a shit ton. We're playing an above average ramp package. We're also playing a lot of 1-mana cantrips. This makes it so the cast of an instant or sorcery can be easily accomplished to recast the opposite from the graveyard, making it pretty much just a 1-mana tax. This lets us reuse our ramp spells in the graveyard by casting an instant like Consider or Op to ramp even quicker. These same cards also help us recast our giant payoff spells later, like Azuri's Predation and Subjugate the Hobbits. Since we're not really playing that many creatures, it is a little more of a control cell. Things like Evacuation, Perplexing Test, and Devastation Tide don't really affect us all too much, especially since Gale is rather cheap to actually cast. This makes Raised by Giants a bit more of a game ender by bouncing your opponent's stuff and then getting in for a ton of commander damage before they can recover. On the enchantment side of things, there's a lot of stuff that helps discount spells like Arcane Melee and Font of Magic. Leyline Immersion is especially nice since it gives Gale protection while turning him to a 5-mana mana dork. Since we're wrapping so much, Omniscience is fairly easy to cast, which let us cast a spell from our hand for free so that mana can be used instead to cast a spell from our graveyard. Since we have so much mana, there's a decent bit of theft spells we get too, stealing our opponent's best creatures for ourselves. Blatant Thievery steals from everyone, Mass Manipulation lets us gain control of multiple creatures and planeswalkers, and Gather Specimens can catch someone by surprise, and it's also just very funny. This deck isn't really meant to be overly amazing, but more just casting big, fun, dumb spells, because what better way to be a sorcerer? Let's move on to maybe on the more weaker side of commanders just by their nature, Will. And it's weaker because Will is built around dice rolling, so you kinda have to build your deck around that. And the colors that do that are red, which Will is, and green and blue. And blue just has the best run, so a rocking is it. Clan Crafter can give more counters by sacrificing artifacts, which is probably honestly better if you're playing with attractions, but I don't want to do that. Same with Charlatan can be good, but then you lose out on Will's effect until it leaves the battlefield. So we went with Swordcore Sailor since Will can get pretty nasty with a handful of dice rolling cards with commander damage. So it doesn't count you when attacking an opponent with the most life. This can guarantee you get in without being able to be blocked, unless Swordcore Sailor or Will themselves are destroyed. Will's another deck that kinda builds itself. You basically play as many dice rolling cards as possible, which thanks to D&D sets and the legal Infinity cards, there's actually a pretty decent amount. Delina Wild Mage is probably one of the best since it can create copies of other creatures, which can include creatures that roll a dice when it enters the battlefield, like Aberrant Mind Sorcerer or Earthcut Elemental. You also have other cards that care about dice being rolled, such as Feywild Trickster, to create tokens, and Faraday Devil's Chosen to give itself flying in minutes, and potentially draw a card. Since Will is attacking so much with Swordcore Savior, various equipment are also included. Lizard Blades gives Will double strike, and Wing Boots gives him both protection and flying. Two-handed axe doubles Will's power and is also a pretty decent instant. Even Sword of the Animus helps you ramp in Izzet colors, which is very appreciated. So it's like a dice sub-roll theme with a Voltron focus as a win condition to win through commander damage. Despite the natural randomness of dice rolling, there are actually a lot of cards that are, well, pretty decent even with bad rolls. Chrono Cold will always tap all creatures your opponents control on its low end, and at best makes them unable to be untapped until their turn after next. There's draw spells like Divinus Potent and Contact Other Plane that also help you get closer to your equipment spells. Will is kinda fun. Maybe it's because I do actually like rolling dice, and do think Will is a pretty fun character in the game. The downside of playing Will is you have to carry a bunch of different dice as if you're going to an actual D&D session. And we've made it to the last of Act 1 companions of Baldur's Gate 3, Carlock, which, people really like Carlock. Her price is pretty much tripled overnight because people were thirsty for a hot tiefling barbarian. And I mean hot literally because, you know, hell. She's another commander where you choose a background with an effect that when you attack, so long as it's the first combat phase, all creatures that were attacking are untapped and there's an extra combat phase. And they also all gain first strike, cause why not? There are a few backgrounds you can use with her. Raised by Giants to basically kill anyone with one string of commander damage, Flaming Fist to give a double strike in 2 combats, her Swordcore Sailor to make her unblockable. But ultimately, I thought to build her a bit more uniquely and a bit more fun, with Acolyte of Bahamut to make Gruul dragons. A lot of dragons have effects that trigger when they attack or deal damage, and Carlock lets them trigger twice. Ataka World Render gives all your dragons double strike when they attack, Dracoseth deals a bunch of burn damage to multiple targets, and Savage Ventmaw gives you 6 damage, half red, half green until the end of turn, which becomes 12 with 2 combat triggers, which is kind of insane. Since dragons are pricey, no I don't mean literally, mana-wise, Acolyte of Bahamut helps discount them, especially since it's pretty easy to get it on the battlefield early. You also have Dragonlord's Servant and Dragon Speaker Summon to discount your dragons even further. Goblin Archaeomancer also discounts all your red and green spells too. While Carlock gives an extra combat step herself, why not add more? Aggravated Assault lets you get another combat and main phase for just 5 mana. War at War gives you the same thing, and it also has Rebound so you can cast it at the next upkeep. We also have Combat Celebrant, which lets you exert it to gain a extra combat. We also get a lot of Dragon-specific ramp in the Mana Rock department. Orb of Dragonkind turns 1 mana into 2 to spend on dragons, and can even sack itself to get a dragon from the top of our 7 cards. Jace Orb of Dragonkind gives the dragon hexproof, and Cornelian Orb can give that dragon haste. There's also plenty of just generically good dragon support, both on dragons themselves and on other permanents. Wrathful Red Dragon makes doing any damage into burn damage to any target, so no one's going to be casting Blasphemous Act on you, otherwise you can just kill the entire table. Crucible of Fire makes all your dragons +3/+3, and when they're flying and attacking twice per turn, this is enough damage to just kill someone, if not the entire table. Ganax gives you a treasure whenever it or another dragon hits the battlefield under your control, and Lathis gives you a 5/5 dragon token when any non-token dragon enters the battlefield. This deck is obviously a very combat-centric deck, playing in tons of power and ramp to get as many dragons as possible as you can onto the battlefield, and taking advantage of attacking and damage effects. This is a deck that can very easily be upgraded since dragons are everywhere and there's a new broken dragon pretty much every fucking set. Now we have the most evil line companion of Baldur's Gate 3, Menthara. She's another one that doesn't have the option to play a background in the first place. Instead, she has rolled X, where X is the number of experience counters you have, which you get these at the end step if a creature left the battlefield that turn and she's on the battlefield. Then she gives all your creatures +1/+0 for each experience counter you have, so she has protection with ward and an anthem effect. For her, I opted for a go white token strategy, though you can also build it with like Blink or just go full on and sacrifice. This one instead is a token deck with a sub-sacrifice theme. As such, we see cards like Rose Strider and Vasira Seer in the list has free sack outlets, along with creatures that just like seeing creatures enter the battlefield or dying, like Ila's Ilkor and Corpse Knight, and of course Julaport Cutthroat. As for the token side, there are plenty of token generators in this list. Rabble Rousing can quickly create a ton of tokens with each attack, Bitter Blossom gives you a constant choice of 1/1 flyers, and Ink Seal is both combat damage protection effect with potential to give you a plethora of 2/1 flying tokens. Keep in mind all these tokens are also getting boosted by Menthara's effect, so they become massive threats that are very easily flooded with. Since we're playing a lot of tokens, we also have cards that can boost them up further outside of Menthara. Call of Unity gets a counter at the end step if a permanent left the battlefield just like Menthara, and gives all your creatures +1/+1 for each counter on it. Hidden Stockpile is similar, though just creates 1/1/1 if a creature left the battlefield. Inspiring Leader also makes it so Menthara gives all your creature tokens a +2/+2 stat boost. A highlight of the deck is Jakira, which creates a 2/2 zombie token with Decayed at your end step if you don't already control one. This guarantees you'll always have something leave the battlefield, since if you attack with it, the token is sacrificed after combat. This token can be even larger when you mix in Menthara with all your other Anthem effects. The only way to get more counters outside of Menthara's effects, and technically Daxos' effects since that's in the list too, is with proliferating. So there's a Lex in the cards that just do that. Drown Ichor is a decent removal spell, and Gulp and Scrap Trap will proliferate on entering the battlefield, as well as when it dies so you can use it twice. Menthara is a sacrifice deck that goes wide for damage, with plenty of ways to create tokens to make sure you don't ever run out of gas. Menthara boosts all your creatures, and others boost just tokens, but you can quickly amass an army for absolute destruction. Although you can't recruit him until Act 2, you do meet Halsin in Act 1, and is the last Act 1 companion we'll be going over. I guess Act 2 companion, but you meet him in Act 1, you know what I mean. He lets you pay 1 mana to make any token into a 4/4 bear until the end of the turn. And like many, you also choose a background with him. There are a few ways to build him. You could go with Selesnya with Inspiring Leader to give your tokens a stat boost and make them a 4/4, or Cloakwood Hermit to make even more tokens in mono green. But I found the coolest to be Feywild Visitor. This makes it so whenever a non-token creature deals combat damage, you create a 1/1 blue fairy dragon token with flying. So for this, we're playing a bunch of cards that are unblockable, like Blighted Agent, Mistcloaked Herald, and Triton Shorestalker to name a few. We also have cards that are unblockable and also loot, like Suspicious Stowaway and Looter Ilkor. Looter is technically blockable, but the odds of you running into someone who's playing a creature with Shadow is slim to none. We have plenty of ways to make tokens, especially treasures. Gala Greeters can do it whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Wave Sister creates 2 clue tokens, and Scoochworm makes a bunch of copies of itself. Bootlegger's Stash turns your lands into treasure token generators, and can be used to fuel Halsin's effect, or just be transformed into bears with it. Fable of Wolf and Owl gives you a token whenever you cast a blue screen spell, which is like almost every spell in your decks, and there's only like 6 that are colorless. Champion of Lambholt can make it so most of your creatures are blockable, and with an army of unblockable temporary bears, especially if they're backed up by Beastmaster Ascension, is devastating. This deck is super explosive and can very quickly go from 0 to 100. And unlike other lists, I also actually have a Pauper Commander deck if that's more your speed, which will also be linked in the description below. We've officially reached Baldur's Gate companions that you don't meet until Act 2. Granted, there's only 2 of them. Let's start with the one you actually meet in Act 2, Jakira. She gives all your tokens the ability to tap for green mana, and you also choose a background with her. There are many different ways to build her, with Inspiring Leader tokens, or perhaps Folk Hero Elves, but this one is a little different, and uses Guild Artisan instead to ramp with treasure tokens since we're going to be needing a lot of mana. This list, rather than being purely go white tokens and ramping the big stuff, it's X spells that deal burn damage. It turns your tokens into ramp to deal as much damage as possible with these. These burn spells include the classic Fireball, along with similar effects like Red Sun Zenith has a burn spell that recycles itself, Devil's Play that also has flashback, and Crackle with power to just deal obscene amounts of damage all over the place. Of course we need mana to get these X's high as hell, so we play a bunch of things that create tokens. Tamio's Journal gives you a clue token at the start of all your turns, and is also a tutor if you have 3 clues to sacrifice. Togo gives you a rock token whenever a land enters the battlefield, and Saga Totenance gives you an X amount of 1/1 tokens that are also all mana tokens with Jakira. You have plenty of spells that just vomit out tokens too. Astron makes a 1/2 whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, and Academy Manufacturer gives you 2 extra tokens for the price of 1. Scoot Swarm can make a giant army of insects that you just turn into fireballs. Basically, most of the deck is cards that create tokens to get into the payoffs. To make things easier for burn to deal lethal damage, we have enchantments that boost the amount of damage all sources deal. You have City on Fire, which deals triple damage and can be convoked with all mana dorks, Dictator of the Twin Gods for double damage, and Fiery Emancipation did triple damage. A fun tech option is Rain of Riches, since it gives a spell cascade if mana spent from a treasure was used for it. But if you make that mana with a hero's effect, the treasure isn't sacrificed, but since you use mana from a treasure, you still get the cascade effect. The deck is quite literally explosive, and basically turns everything you own into something that can produce mana, to then win the game by just dealing direct damage at everyone. It's rather unamusing at first, and then suddenly someone is eating a 40 damage fireball to the face. And we've reached the last commander we're going to be talking about since he's the last companion. This one is of course Ming Skin Boo. Menaces and Legacy, and now we have a commander deck for them. There are a few options to build him, such as +1/+1 counter since he puts so many on so many creatures. Dealing with creatures with trample and haste are also feed into this effect. However, this build is more focused on the -2 effect to sack a creature to deal its power to any target. So this is Mink's Keflinga. The deck plays a ton of creatures with big power like Gahata, Primal Hunger, Desolation Twin, and Pathraiser of Ulamog. Of course, these all cost a ton of mana, so we need a big old ramp package to make sure we can, actually cast them. Also because of that, we have a few ways to cheat these creatures out. Monster Manual lets you pay 2 mana to put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield. Doors of Druid lets you put a creature tapped and attacking if you reveal a creature card on top of your library when you attack. And Sneak Attack to put a creature onto the battlefield for just 1 mana. Sneak Attack does make the creature get sacrificed at the next end step, but we're going to be flinging it anyway, so that doesn't really matter. While Minx can fling creatures himself, we also have a few other ways to do this. Thud only costs 1 mana, but it is a sorcery. Fling is what the mechanic is named after and can be done at instant speed. Kazul's Fury can also act as a land in a pinch. Pyric Blast lets you draw a card, and Bloodshot Cyclops is a fling on a creature so you can keep reusing it. Since we want our creatures to be as large as possible when we're flinging them, cards that easily boost stats are also great as well. Unnatural Growth doubles the power of toughness at the start of each combat for all your creatures, with Zopendrel doing the same. And when combined, this doubles or doubling, which lets you deal an absurd amount of damage both to face and through burn damage. Speaking of, to help close out games, we have Warstorm Surge, which also deals damage equal to a creature's power when it ETBs, and City on Fire and Fiery Emancipation to deal even more burn damage with our sources as well as our creatures. Minx himself is even a draw engine with his -2 effect if you sack a hamster, which you will always have a hamster since he makes a Boo token at the start of your turn if you don't already have one. And his +1 feeds more into it to make Boo even bigger so you can draw more cards with it. And we've made it to the end of the video. That's 10 commander decks for 10 Baldur's Gate 3 companions. Like I said earlier, all these deck lists will be down in the description below, and while you're down there, drop this video a like and do click the subscribe button. Leave a comment there too about what you think of these decks, if they inspired you to build your own Baldur's Gate decks. I've been JakePig, thank you for watching.